Whispers echo through the forgotten corners of New York's history, stories buried beneath decades of progress and noise. But some tales refuse to stay silent. Some nights refuse to be forgotten. And in 1895, something prowled the streets of Lower Manhattan that would force even the most skeptical minds to question what lurks just beyond the edge of our understanding. The gas lamps flickered that October evening, casting nervous shadows across cobblestone streets, still wet from afternoon rain. Horse-drawn carriages clattered past tenement buildings where families huddled behind thin walls, unaware that their city was about to become home to something that shouldn't exist. The air carried that peculiar autumn chill that makes people walk faster, glance over their shoulders, pull their coats tighter, as if some ancient instinct whispers warnings our modern minds refuse to hear. But this wasn't just the ordinary unease of a darkening city. This was different. This was the night the police received a call that would baffle investigators, terrify witnesses, and vanish almost completely from official records. Almost. The first scream cut through the evening around 8:30. A woman's voice, raw with terror, somewhere near the corner of Baxter and Worth Streets. The neighborhood known today for courthouses and civic buildings was then a maze of narrow alleys and cramped apartments, a place where immigrants struggled to build new lives in the shadow of the city's indifference, where gaslight barely reached the darkest corners, where something could hide in plain sight. Officer Thomas Delaney was the first to respond. He'd been walking his beat for 7 years, seen knife fights and robberies, domestic disputes and drunken brawls. Nothing prepared him for what he found in that alley. Nothing in his training, nothing in his experience, nothing in his wildest nightmares could have readied him for the scene that waited in the darkness. The woman was pressed against a brick wall, her dress torn, her face drained of color, even in the dim light. But it wasn't her condition that stopped Delaney in his tracks. It was what she was staring at. What stood between her and the street? What turned its head slowly to look at him with eyes that caught the gaslight and threw it back in shades of amber and gold? The creature stood upright. That detail would appear in every witness statement, in every whispered retelling, in every newspaper article that dared to mention the incident before the stories mysteriously stopped appearing. It stood like a man, but moved like something else entirely. Its body was covered in dark fur, matted and thick. Its hands, if you could call them hands, ended in claws that gleamed wet in the lamplight. And its face was the worst part, a twisted nightmare blend of human and wolf, intelligence and savagery, recognition and hunger. Delaney's hand went to his nightstick. He would later admit that his revolver never even crossed his mind. When faced with something impossible, the human brain reaches for familiar tools, comfortable responses. A nightstick made sense. A nightstick was real. What stood before him couldn't be real, so treating it as real felt somehow wrong. The creature made a sound. Not quite a growl, not quite a snarl. Something that contained words without forming them. A communication that bypassed language and went straight to the most primitive parts of the brain, the parts that remember when humans were prey. Then it moved, not toward him, not toward the woman. It simply turned and leaped. One moment it was there, the next it had cleared the alley wall, vanished into the warren of buildings and shadows that made up that corner of the city. Delaney found his voice. He blew his whistle, the shrill sound cutting through the evening air, summoning help. Within minutes, 3 more officers arrived. The woman was still pressed against the wall, unable to move, unable to speak beyond a few broken syllables. One of the responding officers, a man named Patrick O'Brien, noticed the marks on the wall above her head, deep gouges in the brick, 4 parallel lines where something had scraped against the building, where claws had dug into stone. The official report filed that night was brief, unusually brief, It mentioned an assault, a suspect who fled the scene, a victim too traumatized to provide useful details. It didn't mention the fur. It didn't mention the claws. It didn't mention what Delaney had seen. But here's what most people don't know. Delaney filed a second report, an unofficial one. He took it directly to the precinct captain, a man named James Morrison, who had a reputation for being fair, but hard. Morrison read it. Then he locked it in his desk drawer and told Delaney to never speak of it again. That should have been the end. One terrifying encounter, one hushed-up report, one traumatized woman who would eventually recover and probably spend the rest of her life trying to convince herself she'd imagined the whole thing. But the city had other plans. The creature had other plans. Whatever prowled those streets in 1895 wasn't finished. It was just beginning. 2 nights later, the calls started coming in from different parts of Lower Manhattan. A man working late at a printing shop on Mulberry Street reported seeing something moving on the rooftops. Not a cat, not a person, something else. Something that moved with unnatural speed and grace, leaping gaps between buildings that should have been impossible to cross. He watched it for almost 5 minutes before it seemed to notice him watching. Then it stopped, turned its head, and stared directly at him through the window. He described the same eyes. Amber, gold, intelligent, wrong. The printer survived to tell his story only because he had the presence of mind to step away from the window, to break that connection, to remind himself he was behind glass and walls, and the creature was outside, out there. But even as he reassured himself, even as he backed into the better lit center of his shop, he couldn't shake the feeling that the glass and walls wouldn't matter if the thing decided it wanted in. Meanwhile, 3 blocks away, a night watchman guarding a warehouse heard something on the roof. Heavy footsteps, too heavy to be a cat or rat, too deliberate to be debris shifted by wind. He lit his lantern and climbed the ladder to investigate. Because that was his job. Because he'd been doing it for 15 years without incident. Because the alternative was admitting he was afraid. They found him the next morning, unconscious but alive. His lantern lay shattered nearby. His coat was torn in 4 places, 4 parallel tears that started at the shoulder and ran down to the hem. When he woke up in the hospital, he couldn't remember what had happened, or claimed he couldn't. The doctors said it was a concussion. The other night, watchmen whispered different theories in the taverns after their shifts ended. Within a week, the police had received 17 separate reports of something unusual prowling the streets after dark. 17 official reports. That number doesn't count the people who saw something but didn't tell the authorities. Doesn't count the immigrants who distrusted the police or feared drawing attention to themselves. Doesn't count the ones who convinced themselves they had imagined it, who chose rationality over the evidence of their own eyes. The newspapers started picking up the story, at first with skepticism and humor. The New York Herald ran a piece titled "The Wild Man of Baxter Street" that treated the whole thing as a joke, suggesting it was probably a deranged vagrant or possibly a publicity stunt for a theatrical production. The Evening World published artist renderings based on witness descriptions, but they made it look like a circus act gone wrong, rather than the creature people actually described. But the tone started changing after the 4th week, after the injuries started accumulating, after too many people with no connection to each other from different neighborhoods and backgrounds started telling versions of the same impossible story. The sketch artist's drawings became more serious, more detailed, more frightening, and more consistent. That's when Detective Samuel Wright got involved. Wright was a veteran investigator known for 2 things: his ability to solve seemingly unsolvable cases and his complete lack of imagination. He didn't believe in ghosts, didn't believe in superstition, didn't believe in anything that couldn't be measured, caught, or explained, which made him exactly the wrong person for this case, or exactly the right one. depending on how you looked at it. Wright approached the investigation the way he approached every investigation, with facts, with evidence, with logic. He collected all the witness statements, mapped out the locations, identified patterns, the attacks, because that's what they were. Even if most victims escaped with only torn clothing and terror, followed a geographic cluster. Lower Manhattan, primarily between Canal Street and the Brooklyn Bridge. The timing was consistent too, always after sunset, never past midnight. As if the creature, whatever it was, kept to a schedule. The victims shared certain characteristics. They were always alone, always in transitional spaces, alleyways, quiet streets, the edges between the well-lit and the shadowed, and they were always caught off guard, as if the thing could sense when someone was vulnerable, distracted, unaware. Wright noted all of this in his meticulous handwriting, creating charts and timelines, looking for the pattern that would explain everything away. But there was one detail that bothered him, one detail that appeared in nearly every account, and that he couldn't rationalize. The eyes. Every witness mentioned the eyes, their color, their intensity, and most disturbing of all, their intelligence. These weren't the eyes of a rabid dog or an escaped zoo animal. These were eyes that thought, that calculated, that understood what they were looking at. Wright interviewed Delaney, the first officer on scene. He read the unofficial report that Morrison had locked away, and for the first time in his 20-year career, Detective Samuel Wright felt something he'd never experienced while working a case. He felt afraid, not of what might happen to him, but of what it would mean if what these people described was real. The investigation took a strange turn when Wright visited the medical examiner's office. He'd requested records of any unusual animal attacks in the city over the past year, thinking perhaps there was a prior incident that hadn't been connected to the current situation. What he found instead was something far more disturbing. 3 deaths over the past 8 months, all ruled accidents or natural causes, but all 3 bodies showed similar trauma, lacerations consistent with animal attack, and all 3 had occurred in Lower Manhattan after dark. The medical examiner, a thin man named Dr. Harrison, who looked like he hadn't slept properly in weeks, was reluctant to discuss the cases. When pressed, he admitted that he'd noted the similarities in his private records, but had been discouraged from making those notes official. Discouraged by whom? Dr. Harrison wouldn't say, but his hands shook slightly as he pulled out the files, and his eyes kept darting to the door as if expecting someone to burst in and stop him from sharing what he knew. The first death was a dock worker named John Brennan, found in an alley near the Fulton Fish Market in February. The official cause of death was listed as heart failure resulting from fright. But Dr. Harrison's private notes described defensive wounds on the arms, deep lacerations that had bled profusely before death, and tissue damage consistent with large claws. The pattern of the wounds suggested the victim had been facing his attacker when he died. The second death was a woman named Catherine O'Malley, discovered in May behind a laundry where she worked. Official cause: accidental fall resulting in fatal head trauma. Private notes: scratches on face and hands that appeared before death, not after. Torn clothing, and something Dr. Harrison had underlined twice in his notes: fur, animal fur clutched in her right hand that didn't match any common domestic or wild animal in the region. The third death was a teenage boy named Michael Rossi, found in August behind his family's grocery store. Official cause: attacked by stray dogs. Private notes: wounds too large and too deep for dogs. Bite pattern inconsistent with canine jaw structure, and a detail that made Wright's blood run cold: the boy's body had been partially dragged. The marks in the dirt suggested something had gripped him and tried to move him before being interrupted or changing its mind. 3 deaths, 3 cover-ups, and now 17 attacks in the space of a month. Whatever this was, it was escalating. Wright left the medical examiner's office with copies of the private notes, despite Dr. Harrison's protests, and headed directly to see Captain Morrison. He demanded to know what was being hidden and why. Morrison's response was not what Wright expected. The captain didn't deny anything, didn't try to deflect or defend. Instead, he closed his office door, pulled down the shade on the window facing the precinct floor, and poured them both a whiskey, despite the early hour. Then he told Wright a story he'd been told by his own captain when he was a young officer, a story about something that had happened in New York before, long before. According to Morrison, there were incidents, that's the word he used, incidents, plural, going back to the city's earliest days, periods of several months where strange attacks would occur, where witnesses would report impossible things, where the authorities would quietly investigate and then just as quietly bury the files. The pattern repeated roughly every 30 years, sometimes shorter, sometimes longer, but it always came back. The city's founding families knew about it. The oldest money, the oldest names, they'd created informal procedures for dealing with these incidents. Keep the stories out of the papers as much as possible. Don't let panic spread. Don't let people start asking questions that couldn't be answered. And above all, don't create official records that future generations might stumble upon and start investigating. Wright asked the obvious question. What was it? What were they covering up? Morrison's answer was simple and terrifying. He didn't know. No one knew. The creatures, because there was never just one, would appear. They would attack. And then, after a few months, they would vanish again. Either they left the city, or they went dormant, or they died. The pattern never changed. The attacks would escalate to a peak, and then suddenly stop. And everyone involved would agree to forget, to move on, to pretend it never happened. But this time felt different, Morrison admitted. This time, the attacks were more frequent, more violent, more public. And this time, people were refusing to forget. The newspapers wouldn't let it go. The public was demanding answers, and Detective Samuel Wright, with his reputation and his persistence, was exactly the kind of problem the old arrangement couldn't handle. Wright left Morrison's office with more questions than answers, but he also left with a determination to see this through. Whatever was happening, whatever ancient agreement protected these creatures, he was going to expose it. He was going to find the truth, even if that truth destroyed him. The investigation intensified. Wright recruited a small team of officers he trusted, men who'd seen too much to dismiss the impossible out of hand. Together, they began a systematic patrol of Lower Manhattan after dark, armed with revolvers and electric torches, a new technology that was slowly replacing the old gas lamps. They worked in pairs, maintaining sight lines with other teams, creating a loose net across the streets where the attacks had been concentrated. For 3 nights, nothing happened. The streets remained quiet. Some of the men started to relax, started to joke that maybe the thing had moved on or had never been real in the first place. Wright didn't relax. He studied the patterns, checked his maps, and felt increasingly certain they were being watched, being evaluated. The creature or creatures were out there, waiting, planning, showing an intelligence that made the situation infinitely more dangerous. On the 4th night, everything changed. The attack came just after 10 o'clock on Mott Street near the intersection with Pell. 2 of Wright's men, Officers Keegan and Sullivan, were walking their patrol route when they heard it. A sound that started as a woman's scream and then cut off abruptly. Too abruptly. They ran toward the source, torches swinging, and found her in the doorway of a shuttered shop. She was alive. Terrified but alive, and she was pointing up, not at the street level, not at the alley, up at the building across from her. at the thing clinging to the brick wall 3 stories above the ground, watching them with those same amber eyes that had haunted every report. It hung there impossibly, defying gravity and reason, its claws dug into the mortar between bricks, its body perfectly still, except for the slight turn of its head as it tracked their movements. Keegan raised his revolver. Sullivan grabbed his arm, stopped him. Not because he doubted they should shoot, but because he understood instinctively that firing at something clinging to a building above a crowded street was dangerous for reasons that had nothing to do with the creature itself. The bullet would have to go up, and what goes up must come down, somewhere, into someone's window, someone's home, someone's child. The creature seemed to understand this calculation, seemed to recognize their hesitation for what it was. And in that moment, in that terrible frozen second, both officers realized they weren't dealing with an animal. They were dealing with something that thought, that reasoned, that understood human weakness and human law and used both against them. Then it moved, not down toward them, not away. It simply released its hold on the wall and fell 3 stories, straight down. Any human body would have shattered on impact. Any animal would have broken bones, would have been stunned, would have needed time to recover. This thing landed in a crouch that absorbed the impact perfectly, rose to its full height, and then it was running. Not on all 4s like a wolf or dog, upright, on 2 legs like a man, but faster than any man could move. Sullivan blew his whistle. The shrill sound echoed through the narrow streets, alerting the other teams. Keegan helped the woman to her feet, got her inside the nearest building, and then both officers gave chase. They ran harder than they'd ever run in their lives, their torches bouncing wildly, throwing crazy shadows across the buildings. But it wasn't enough. The creature was pulling away from them, its form getting smaller in the distance until it turned a corner and vanished completely. By the time Wright arrived with reinforcements, the street was chaos. Residents had come out of their apartments, demanding to know what was happening. Shopkeepers peered from windows. Children who should have been asleep pressed their faces against glass, wide-eyed and frightened. The woman who'd been attacked was in shock, unable to form coherent sentences. And Keegan and Sullivan were bent over, hands on knees, gasping for air and trying to explain what they'd seen. Wright took control quickly. He dispersed the crowd, posted guards at both ends of the street, and conducted a thorough search of the immediate area. They found claw marks on the building where the creature had clung, deep gouges that went through the brick, facing into the mortar beneath. They found tracks in a patch of mud near where it had landed, prints that looked almost human but elongated, with clear impressions where claws had dug into the earth. And they found something else, something that would change the nature of the investigation entirely. On the rooftop of the building where the creature had been perched, they discovered a torn piece of cloth. Not fur, not animal hide. Cloth. Black wool, the kind used in men's coats. The kind worn by hundreds of men throughout the city every single day. The edge was jagged, as if it had been ripped rather than cut. And when Dr. Harrison examined it later, he confirmed what Wright had already begun to suspect. This cloth hadn't been torn by claws from the outside. It had been torn from the inside, as if something had burst out of the clothing, as if the creature and the man were somehow the same. The implications were staggering. If this wasn't simply an animal, if it was somehow a person transformed, then everything changed. The investigation wasn't looking for a creature. It was looking for a person. Someone who walked among them during the day. Someone who held a job, had neighbors, maybe even had a family. Someone who became something else when darkness fell. Wright assembled his team in a private room at the precinct. 6 men total, all sworn to secrecy. He laid out the evidence piece by piece and watched their faces as understanding dawned. One of the officers, a young man named Collins, who'd transferred from Boston just the year before, spoke up. He mentioned a case from his previous city, a series of attacks that had never been solved, witnesses describing something similar, though the details had been dismissed as hysteria. The attacks had lasted about 3 months and then stopped abruptly. No arrests, no explanations, just silence. Another officer, Ryan, mentioned hearing stories from his grandfather, tales of the old country, Ireland, specifically County Antrim, where legend spoke of people who could shed their human form like a coat and become something else. Wolves that walked on 2 legs, creatures of ancient curse or ancient blood. Depending on which version of the story you believed, the older folk took such things seriously, built their houses with certain protections, avoided certain places on certain nights. The younger generations laughed until something happened that made them stop laughing. Wright listened to all of it, the stories, the theories, the speculation. Then he did what he always did. He focused on what could be proven, what could be tracked, what could be caught. They had a geographic pattern. They had a time pattern. They had evidence that suggested the creature was also a person. That meant they could narrow down suspects. Look at who lived or worked in the affected area, who had no alibi during the attack times, who might have access to the locations where evidence was found. The work was meticulous and exhausting. They pulled records, conducted interviews, established timelines. The list of potential suspects started at over 200 names and slowly, methodically began to shrink. They eliminated men who had solid alibis, men who were physically incapable of the athleticism displayed by the creature, men whose character and reputation made them unlikely candidates. Within 2 weeks, they'd narrowed it down to 17 possibilities. But the attacks continued. Despite increased patrols, despite heightened awareness, despite people staying indoors after dark, the creature struck again and again. Each incident followed the same pattern. Isolated target, quick attack, escape before reinforcements arrived. It was taunting them, demonstrating that their efforts were meaningless, that it could strike whenever and wherever it chose. The pressure on Wright was enormous. The newspapers had gotten hold of the story in full now, and their coverage had gone from skeptical to sensational. Artists' renderings of the creature appeared on front pages. Competing theories were debated in editorials. Some writers blamed escaped zoo animals. Others suggested a deranged killer wearing a costume. A few brave souls mentioned the word that no one in the police department would say aloud: werewolf. The public reaction was predictable and dangerous. Neighborhood watch groups formed, armed with clubs and knives. Vigilante patrols roamed the streets, attacking anyone who looked suspicious or different. 2 innocent men were nearly beaten to death before police intervened. The panic was spreading faster than the attacks themselves, threatening to tear apart the fragile social fabric of a city already strained by poverty, immigration, and rapid change. City Hall demanded results. The mayor wanted this situation resolved before it damaged his administration. The police commissioner wanted someone to blame, and Wright found himself caught between the impossible task of catching something that shouldn't exist and the very real political consequences of failure. Then came November 3rd, 1895, the night that would change everything, the night Wright and his team finally got close enough to see the transformation, close enough to understand exactly what they were dealing with, and close enough to realize that understanding it didn't mean they could stop it. The trap was carefully planned. Wright had noticed that the attacks, while seemingly random, actually followed a subtle pattern based on lunar cycles. They intensified during the 3 days surrounding the new moon, when the sky was darkest, when shadows were deepest, when fear came easiest. He positioned his men in a tight grid around the area most likely to be hit, with himself at the center, ready to respond from any direction. They waited in the cold November darkness, watching their breath mist in the air, listening to the distant sounds of the city settling into night, carriages rattling home, tavern doors closing, mothers calling children inside, the ordinary sounds of life that continued regardless of what hunted in the shadows. Wright checked his pocket watch. 9:30. If the pattern held, the creature would strike within the next hour. The scream came at 9:47. A man's voice, rough with terror, somewhere near the corner of Bayard and Elizabeth. Wright and 2 officers ran toward the sound, their footsteps echoing off the buildings, their torches cutting through the darkness. They turned onto Elizabeth Street and stopped. The victim was on the ground, alive but bleeding from wounds on his shoulder, and standing over him, caught in the beams of their electric torches, was the creature. But they'd arrived at exactly the wrong moment, or the right moment, depending on your perspective, because what they witnessed wasn't an attack. It was a transformation. The creature was changing, its form rippling and shifting, fur receding, body contorting, features reforming. The process took perhaps 30 seconds. 30 seconds of watching something impossible become something else impossible. And when it was done, when the transformation completed, they weren't looking at a monster anymore. They were looking at a man. He was young, maybe 30 years old. Dark hair, lean build, dressed in the torn remnants of clothing that had clearly not survived the change intact. He looked at them with those same amber eyes, now set in a human face, and for a moment, no one moved. No one breathed. The world had stopped turning while they all processed what they'd just seen. The man spoke. His voice was rough, unused, as if speaking required effort after whatever he'd just been through. What he said was simple. He said he was sorry, that he didn't want this, that he couldn't control it, that he'd tried everything, every cure and prayer and desperate measure, but nothing worked. Every month when the moon went dark, he lost himself, became something else, hurt people he never meant to hurt, and he couldn't stop it, couldn't end it, could only wait for it to pass and hope he hadn't killed anyone this time. Wright approached slowly, his hand on his revolver but not drawing it. He asked the man's name. The response was barely a whisper. Daniel Whitmore. He worked as a clerk in a shipping office, had immigrated from England 2 years ago, thought he'd left his curse behind when he crossed the ocean, thought distance and new beginnings might break whatever dark thing had attached itself to him. But the curse traveled with him, inside him, part of him, and now he'd brought this nightmare to a new city, to innocent people who'd done nothing to deserve it. Behind Wright, one of the officers raised his gun, aimed at Whitmore's chest, asked permission to fire. The wounded man on the ground was screaming for them to kill the creature, to end it now while they had the chance. Other officers were arriving, blocking the street, creating a perimeter. Someone was shouting about calling for a wagon. Someone else was demanding answers about what they just witnessed. Wright held up his hand, stopped everything, because he was looking into Whitmore's eyes and seeing something there that made this complicated. He was seeing a person, not a monster, not a beast. A person trapped inside something terrible. A person who was as much a victim as anyone he'd attacked. Maybe more so, because he had to live with the memory of what he'd done, had to wake up and piece together the horror from torn clothes and blood under his fingernails and gaps in his memory that could only be filled by reading newspaper accounts of attacks he couldn't quite remember committing. The question Wright faced in that moment was profound. How do you arrest someone for crimes they committed while literally not themselves? How do you prosecute something that might not be a crime at all, but a disease? A curse? A condition beyond anyone's ability to understand or control? The law had no answers for this. The legal system had no framework. They were in territory where human justice and human law simply didn't apply. Whitmore solved the problem for them. Or tried to. He turned and ran, not attacking, not threatening, just running, trying to escape, trying to disappear back into the city and the darkness where he'd been hiding, where he thought he could contain his secret and his shame. 3 officers gave chase, but Wright called them back. "Let him go," he ordered. "Let him run." Because Wright had seen something in that moment. He'd seen how close the man was to transforming again, how his hands had started to shake, how his eyes had begun to shift color, how his breathing had changed rhythm. The stress of confrontation was triggering another change, and if Whitmore transformed while surrounded by armed police, people would die, probably starting with Whitmore himself. The team regrouped, treated the wounded man who would survive with nothing worse than scars and a story no one would fully believe, collected evidence, photographed the scene using the new flash powder technology that lit up the street like lightning for brief, blinding instants, and tried to make sense of what they'd witnessed, tried to write a report that would somehow capture the impossible and make it fit into the ordered world of police procedure and criminal investigation. Wright didn't go back to the precinct. He went to the city archives, spent the entire night reading through old records, following the thread Morrison had given him, looking for the pattern, the incidents that repeated every 30 years. He found them, not in police files. Those had been destroyed or hidden, but in newspaper archives, in death records, in hospital admissions, in the spaces between official history where truth gets buried. 1862. Attacks matching the current pattern lasted 3 months, ended abruptly. No arrests, no explanations. 1831. Same thing, 1799. The records went further back, but became harder to verify, vaguer, mixed with legend and superstition. But the pattern was there, regular as clockwork, a curse that returned, or a bloodline that persisted, or something else that Wright's rational mind refused to fully accept, even as the evidence mounted. He found something else too. In each incident, there was a name. Someone who disappeared around the time the attack stopped. Someone who left the city suddenly, or died mysteriously, or simply vanished from all records. In 1862, it was a baker named Thompson. In 1831, a dock worker named Brennan. Different people, different backgrounds, but all young men, all recent immigrants, all alone in the city without family or close connections, all perfect candidates to hide a terrible secret. Wright sat in the dim archive room as dawn began to break over the city, surrounded by yellowed newspapers and crumbling ledgers, and understood something that made his blood run cold. This wasn't random. This wasn't chaos. This was a cycle, a pattern that had been repeating for over a century, possibly longer. And every time it happened, the city's powerful made the same choice: protect the reputation of New York, maintain order, let the truth disappear into locked files and forgotten memories, let the victims become statistics, let the monster escape, only to return again in another generation. But knowing the pattern didn't tell him how to break it. Whitmore was still out there, still transforming, still attacking, and Wright had no legal authority to do what might actually need to be done, because the solution that kept suggesting itself, the solution that every instinct screamed was necessary, was something he couldn't even put into words without admitting he'd abandoned everything he believed about law and justice and civilization. He left the archives as city workers were beginning to arrive, blinking in the harsh morning light, feeling like he'd aged a decade overnight. His team was waiting at the precinct. They'd tracked Whitmore to a boarding house in 5 Points, one of the city's worst slums, a place where people didn't ask questions about their neighbors, where anonymity could be purchased for a few dollars a week, where someone could disappear into a crowd of desperate, struggling souls who had their own secrets to keep. The building was a 5-story tenement that leaned slightly to one side, as if tired of standing. The smell hit them before they entered. Unwashed bodies, rotting food, human waste, and something else underneath it all. Fear. The residents of this building knew something was wrong. They just didn't know what. Or they knew and had decided that silence was safer than speaking up. Whitmore's room was on the 4th floor, at the end of a hallway so narrow 2 men could barely walk side by side. The landlady, a woman named Mrs. Kowalski, who'd seen more than her share of trouble in her 60 years, gave them the key without argument. She'd been waiting for the police to come, had known they would eventually, had watched Whitmore come and go at strange hours, had noticed how he never met anyone's eyes, how he seemed to shrink into himself, as if trying to take up as little space as possible in the world. The room was spare. A narrow bed, a washstand, a single window overlooking an alley. Whitmore's few possessions were neatly arranged, as if he was always ready to leave at a moment's notice. His clothes hung on pegs, multiple sets, all showing the same pattern of repairs around the shoulders and chest where seams had split. A leather journal sat on the small table beside the bed, and Wright picked it up with hands that weren't quite steady. The entries dated back 3 years. Started in London, described the first transformation, written in a hand that shook so badly the words were barely legible. Whitmore had thought he was dying, thought some terrible disease had seized him. He'd locked himself in his room, felt his body tear itself apart and rebuild itself into something else, spent hours as a creature that existed between nightmare and reality. When he'd woken the next morning, human, again, covered in blood that wasn't his own, he'd found a dead dog in the alley below his window, torn apart, partially eaten. The entries tracked his desperate attempts to understand what was happening to him. He'd consulted doctors who diagnosed everything from epilepsy to madness. He'd sought out priests who'd offered prayers and holy water that did nothing. He'd visited a woman in Whitechapel who dealt in old magic, old knowledge, old curses. She'd told him the truth, that he carried something in his blood, something ancient, something that couldn't be cured because it wasn't a disease. It was what he was, what he'd always been. The transformations would continue for the rest of his life, tied to the lunar cycle, triggered by darkness and stress and the ancient rhythms that predated human civilization. She'd also told him something else, something that Wright read twice to make sure he understood, that he wasn't alone, that there were others like him scattered across the world, that they recognized each other somehow, some instinct or scent or subtle signal that normal humans couldn't perceive, and that sometimes when the curse was particularly strong, when the bloodline was particularly pure, they were drawn to the same places, concentrated in cities where the population was dense enough to hide among, but also provided enough prey to satisfy the hunger that came with the transformation. Whitmore had fled England hoping to escape both the curse and any others who might be drawn to it. But according to the later entries, he'd begun to suspect he wasn't the only one in New York. There were signs, territorial markings he recognized but couldn't explain how he knew what they meant. Scents on the wind that triggered something primal in him. Dreams of running through the city in a form that wasn't his own, but encountering others. Being watched, being evaluated, being warned. The final entry was dated 3 days ago. Just 2 sentences. They're coming for me. I don't know if I should run or let them find me. Wright closed the journal and looked at his men, asked them what they'd found. The answer was nothing and everything, nothing that would stand up in court, but everything that confirmed what they already knew. Whitmore was the creature they'd been hunting, and if the journal was accurate, he might not be the only one. The question was what to do with that information. Wright could arrest Whitmore on sight, assuming they found him again, but what charges would hold? Assault? The victims had seen a monster, not a man. Their testimony would be dismissed as hysteria. Attempted murder? The attacks had been violent, but none had been fatal, at least not recently. The 3 deaths from earlier in the year couldn't be definitively connected without evidence that would require explaining the transformation, which no judge or jury would believe, or Wright could do what the city's powerful had apparently been doing for over a century. Look the other way. Let Whitmore disappear. Hope he left New York and became someone else's problem. Continue the cycle of denial and cover-up that protected the city's reputation at the cost of truth and justice. Or there was a third option, one that Wright had been trying not to think about, one that violated everything he'd sworn to uphold, but might be the only real solution. Find Whitmore during his human hours and put a bullet in him, not as punishment, not as execution, but as mercy, ending a curse that couldn't be broken, stopping attacks that couldn't be prevented any other way, murder in service of a greater good that the law couldn't address. He was still wrestling with that question when the next attack happened. But this one was different. This one changed everything, because the victim wasn't a random stranger caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. The victim was one of Wright's own officers, young Collins, the transfer from Boston. He'd been walking a patrol route in broad daylight, 3 in the afternoon, when something had dragged him into an alley and torn into him with claws and teeth before fleeing. Witnesses described the attacker as a large dog or wolf, but Collins, before he lost consciousness from blood loss, had described something else. He'd described a woman whose hands had become claws, whose face had begun to shift and change even as she attacked, whose eyes had been the same amber gold that haunted every report. Collins survived, barely. The doctors said he'd lost almost half his blood. That another few minutes, and he'd have been beyond saving. But survival came with a cost, with questions that couldn't be ignored, with evidence that the situation was even worse than Wright had thought. Because if there was a woman, if there were multiple creatures hunting in the city, then Whitmore's journal entry made terrible sense. They're coming for me. Not they, as in the police. They, as in others of his kind. Others drawn to New York. Others who saw him as either competition or prey or something else entirely. Wright visited Collins in the hospital, found him feverish and delirious, muttering about eyes and teeth and transformations. The wounds on his chest and arms were deep, would leave permanent scars, but it was the change in Collins's eyes that disturbed Wright most. Even sedated, even weakened by blood loss, there was something different about them, something that caught the light wrong, something that suggested the attack had done more than just physical damage. The nurse mentioned that Collins had been having nightmares, violent ones. He'd woken screaming 3 times, talking about running through streets on all 4s, about tasting blood, about feeling his body change shape. The doctors thought it was trauma. Wright feared it was something worse, that the attack had been more than an attack, that it had been a transmission, that Collins had been infected or cursed or marked by whatever darkness flowed through these creatures' veins. Wright left the hospital with a plan forming, a desperate, dangerous plan that went against every principle he'd built his career on, but he couldn't see any alternative. The city authorities wouldn't act. The law couldn't handle this, and every day that passed brought more attacks, more victims, more chances for this curse to spread. If Collins had been infected, how many others had been? How many people walking the streets of New York were carrying something inside them that would eventually surface? How many ticking time bombs were hidden in plain sight? He needed to find Whitmore, not to arrest him, to talk to him, to understand, because Whitmore was the only source of information they had, the only one who could explain what was happening, how it spread, how it might be stopped. And maybe, if Wright was very lucky and very persuasive, the only one who could help prevent this situation from spiraling completely out of control. The search intensified. Wright put every available man on it, pulled in favors from other precincts, even quietly contacted some of the city's criminal elements. Because if anyone could find a man trying to hide in New York's shadows, it was the people who lived in those shadows themselves. He offered money, promised immunity for minor offenses, did things he'd never done before, and hoped he'd never have to do again. 3 days of searching yielded nothing. Whitmore had vanished completely, as if he'd never existed. The boarding house landlady hadn't seen him. His employer at the shipping office reported he'd stopped showing up for work. No one in the neighborhoods where attacks had occurred remembered seeing anyone matching his description. It was as if he'd been swallowed by the city itself, become one more ghost in a place full of forgotten people and buried secrets. Then, on the fourth night, Wright received a message, not through official channels, not from any of his contacts. It was delivered by a street child, a girl no more than 10 years old, who handed him a folded piece of paper and ran before he could ask questions. The note was written in the same shaking hand Wright had seen in Whitmore's journal. It gave an address and a time. Midnight. The old Trinity Church Cemetery. Come alone. Wright knew it was likely a trap. Knew that walking into a graveyard at midnight to meet a werewolf was possibly the stupidest thing he'd done in his entire career. But he also knew it might be his only chance, his only opportunity to get answers, to maybe find a way to end this without more bloodshed. So he went. Against every instinct and all common sense, he went. The cemetery was older than the city around it. Headstones dated back to the 1600s. Weathered and tilted, marking graves of people whose names had been forgotten by everyone except the stone. Trees grew thick among the plots, their branches creating a canopy that blocked out what little light the gas lamps provided. The place felt heavy, as if the weight of centuries pressed down on anyone who entered. Wright found Whitmore sitting on a tomb near the back of the cemetery, his form barely visible in the darkness. He looked smaller than Wright remembered, thinner, exhausted, like a man who hadn't slept properly in months. When he spoke, his voice was rough and filled with something that might have been relief or resignation, or both. He thanked Wright for coming, for not bringing an army of police, for being willing to listen. Then he started talking, and what he said painted a picture even more disturbing than Wright had imagined. The curse was old, older than Christianity, older than written history. It ran in bloodlines passed from parent to child, sometimes skipping generations, but always returning. Those who carried it had no choice in their transformation. When the conditions were right, when the moon was dark, and their emotions were heightened, the change took them whether they wanted it or not. Most learned to control it somewhat, to recognize the signs, to isolate themselves during dangerous periods, to minimize the damage they caused. But control was never complete. The beast inside was always there, always hungry, always seeking an opportunity to break free. And sometimes something would trigger an intensification. Stress, trauma, proximity to others of their kind. The transformations would become more frequent, more violent, harder to resist. That's what was happening in New York. There were at least 3 others in the city. Whitmore had sensed them, had tried to avoid them, but they'd found him anyway. One was the woman who'd attacked Collins. Another was a man who worked on the docks. The third was someone Whitmore had never seen in human form, but knew was out there, hunting, marking territory, drawing them all into some kind of competition or hierarchy that operated on rules older than civilization. The woman was the most dangerous. She was older, had been dealing with the curse longer, had less humanity left to restrain the beast. She saw the city as her hunting ground, and the others as intruders. She was the one leaving the most violent attacks, the one pushing boundaries, the one who might eventually kill someone if she hadn't already. And she was the one who'd infected Collins deliberately, as a warning to Whitmore and the others, a demonstration of power. a claim to territory. Wright listened to all of this and felt something inside him crack. Because if Whitmore was telling the truth, if there really were multiple cursed individuals in the city, then this wasn't a problem that could be solved. It was a situation that could only be managed or fled from. And the idea of fleeing, of letting this spread and grow and continue, was intolerable. He asked Whitmore the question that had been building since the investigation began. Is there a cure? Any way to break the curse? Whitmore's laugh was bitter and broken. He'd spent years searching for that answer. Traveled across Europe, consulted with people who dealt in old magic and older knowledge. The answer was always the same. No. Once the curse was in your blood, it stayed. You could fight it. You could sometimes delay it, but you couldn't cure it. Death was the only escape. So Wright asked the next question, the harder one, the one that had been haunting him since he'd read Whitmore's journal. What do you want me to do? Why did you ask me here? Whitmore stood up from the tomb, walked closer, and in the dim light, Wright could see tears on his face, could hear the desperation in his voice when he spoke. Because what Whitmore wanted was simple and terrible. He wanted Wright to kill him, to end the curse by ending his life. He'd tried to do it himself, had put a gun to his head multiple times, but couldn't pull the trigger. The survival instinct was too strong, even when he knew survival meant more attacks, more victims, more blood. But if someone else did it, if Wright shot him right now, it would be mercy. It would be justice for everyone he'd hurt. It would be prevention of all the attacks yet to come. And more than that, Whitmore wanted Wright to hunt the others, to find them during their human hours when they were vulnerable, to do what the law couldn't do and what morality suggested shouldn't be done, but what necessity demanded. Put bullets in them. End the curse by ending the cursed. Not as murder, but as the only realistic solution to a problem that transcended normal criminal justice. Wright's hand went to his revolver. His fingers closed around the grip. He could do it. One shot. Center mass. Whitmore would die quickly. The curse would die with him. One less monster hunting in the city's shadows. One less source of nightmares and trauma and death. It would be so easy, and it would haunt Wright for the rest of his life. He drew the gun, aimed it, watched Whitmore close his eyes and wait, saw the tension leave the man's shoulders as if he was finally going to find peace. And Wright couldn't do it, couldn't pull the trigger, because once he crossed that line, once he became an executioner, rather than an officer of the law, there was no coming back. He'd be as much a monster as the thing he was killing. Just a different kind. He lowered the gun, told Whitmore he wouldn't, that there had to be another way, that they could find it together, that giving up wasn't an option. Whitmore opened his eyes and looked at Wright with something that might have been disappointment or might have been relief. Then he spoke again, and his words were barely a whisper. It's too late for me. But maybe not for the others. Collins, the officer who was attacked, he's changing. You've seen it. In a few weeks, maybe a month, the transformation will complete. He'll become what I am, what the woman is, but he's still in that window, where it might be stopped, where there might still be a choice. The old woman in London mentioned something, a ritual, a purging. It's never been proven, might not work, but it's the only chance he has. Whitmore pulled a piece of paper from his pocket. On it was written an address, a name. Someone in New York who dealt in the old knowledge, the old ways. Someone who might be able to help Collins before it was too late. And someone who might have information about the others, about how to find them, about how to stop them, without becoming a murderer himself. Wright took the paper, asked Whitmore what he was going to do. The answer was simple. Leave. Get as far from New York as possible. Go west, where the population was sparse and the wilderness was vast, and a man who turned into a monster once a month might be able to live without hurting anyone. It wasn't ideal. It wasn't a cure. But it was better than staying and adding to the body count. They parted ways in that cemetery. Two men who'd been hunting each other, coming to an understanding that satisfied neither, but might save lives. Wright watched Whitmore disappear into the darkness between the graves and wondered if he'd just made the biggest mistake of his career, or possibly the only moral choice in a situation where morality had become impossibly complicated. The address Whitmore had given led to a small shop in Chinatown, the kind of place tourists avoided and locals whispered about. The woman who ran it was ancient, her face mapped with wrinkles, her eyes bright with an intelligence that seemed to see through skin and bone to whatever lay beneath. She spoke broken English, but perfect understanding, nodding when Wright mentioned Whitmore's name, gesturing him to sit, pouring tea that smelled of herbs and smoke and something indefinable. She told him about the curse, about how it lived in the blood but also in the spirit, about how it could sometimes be pushed back if caught early enough, if the infected person had strong will and was willing to endure pain that went beyond physical. The ritual she described was part medicine, part magic, part psychological battle. It required 3 nights of preparation, 3 nights of purging body and mind, and then a final confrontation where the person had to face the beast inside themselves and reject it. Assert their humanity over the curse. Most people failed. The curse was stronger, but sometimes, rarely, someone had enough will to succeed. Wright asked how much it would cost. The old woman smiled and named a price that was simultaneously reasonable and impossible. Not money. Truth. Wright would have to tell her everything he knew about the others, about the woman, about the dock worker, about any others he encountered. She collected information the way some people collected coins or stamps. Knowledge was her currency, her protection, her power, in a city that would otherwise have no use for an elderly Chinese woman who dealt in magic no one believed dovulved in. So, Wright told her everything from the investigation, every detail from the reports, every piece of evidence they'd gathered. When he finished, she nodded slowly and said she could help Collins. But Wright would have to bring him here willingly. The ritual didn't work if the person was forced. They had to choose to fight the curse, choose to reject what was growing inside them, choose pain and struggle over the seductive ease of giving in. The next week was the hardest of Wright's career. He visited Collins daily, watched the changes accelerate, watched the man struggle with urges he didn't understand and transformations he could barely control, watched him wake up with blood under his fingernails and no memory of how it got there. Watched the fear and shame and desperation grow until Collins was ready to try anything, believe anything, if it meant stopping what was happening to him. Wright brought him to the shop in Chinatown, watched as the old woman prepared her herbs and drew her symbols and spoke in languages Wright didn't recognize. Watched Collins drink foul-tasting mixtures and sit in silence and slowly, painfully, begin to fight the thing inside him. The ritual took a week. 7 nights of Collins confronting the beast in his blood, of screaming and sweating, and occasionally transforming partially, his face shifting, his hands becoming claws before he forced them back to human shape through sheer will. On the 7th night, Collins broke, or the curse broke. It was hard to tell which. He collapsed, unconscious, his body finally settling into purely human form. When he woke, hours later, the amber tint was gone from his eyes. The old woman examined him and nodded, said the curse was pushed back, not cured, never cured, but suppressed, locked away where it couldn't reach him unless he let it. He'd have to maintain that lock through discipline and will for the rest of his life, but he'd won. He'd kept his humanity. Wright paid the old woman in more information, told her about additional sightings, about patterns he'd noticed, about theories his team had developed. She listened and added it all to whatever vast network of knowledge she maintained. Then she told him something that changed how he understood the entire situation. The curse couldn't be destroyed, but it could be managed, contained, and there were others in cities across the world doing exactly that. People who knew the truth, who worked quietly to identify and track and sometimes eliminate those who carried the curse and couldn't or wouldn't control it. New York had such a group once. Decades ago, they'd maintained the balance, dealt with incidents before they became crises, helped those who wanted help, and stopped those who couldn't be helped. But they'd faded. Members had died or moved away. The knowledge had been lost. The city had forgotten. And now the curse was returning unchecked because there was no one left who knew how to handle it properly. She suggested Wright consider rebuilding that network. Not official, never official. The city authorities would never support something that required believing in curses and werewolves, but quietly, underground. A group of people who knew the truth and were willing to act on it. To protect the innocent, to help those who could be helped. And yes, to stop those who couldn't. To do what the law wouldn't and couldn't do. Wright left that shop with his mind spinning, returned to his precinct and his normal duties, and tried to process everything he'd learned. Tried to figure out what came next, how to build something from nothing, how to protect a city from threats it refused to acknowledge existed. The attacks stopped 2 weeks later. Suddenly, completely, just like the pattern from history suggested they would. Whitmore was presumably somewhere out west. Collins was recovering and would eventually return to duty, a changed man in ways no one but Wright understood. The woman and the dock worker and any others had either left the city or gone dormant, or were simply being more careful. The newspapers moved on to other stories. The public's fear faded. Life returned to normal. But Wright knew it wasn't over, knew it would happen again. Maybe in 30 years, maybe sooner. The curse would return. Others would come, and the city would be just as unprepared unless someone did something about it. Unless someone maintained the knowledge, tracked the patterns, watched for the signs. He started small, kept copies of all the files, the evidence, the witness statements, created a private archive separate from official records, began reaching out to the officers who'd been involved, who'd seen things they couldn't explain, who might be willing to believe the impossible and act on it, formed connections with people like the old woman in Chinatown, individuals who operated in the spaces between the official and the occult, who dealt in truths too strange for daylight. Collins became his first recruit, then Officer O'Brien, who'd seen the claw marks on the wall and never quite convinced himself they were made by anything normal. Then a doctor named Harrison, who'd performed autopsies on victims and seen things that didn't match any known animal attack. Slowly, carefully, a network formed. People who knew, who believed, who were willing to watch and wait and act when necessary. The official story of 1895 became just another forgotten incident in New York's vast history. The newspapers stopped writing about it. The police files were buried or destroyed. The witnesses moved on or convinced themselves they'd imagined things, or simply stayed quiet because speaking up meant being labeled insane. Captain Morrison retired and took his secrets with him. The city's powerful breathed easier, secure, in the knowledge that the reputation of New York had been protected once again. But in the shadows, in the quiet spaces, the truth persisted. Wright and his small network watched, waited, documented, prepared for the day when the curse would return because they knew it would. The pattern was too consistent, the history too clear. Somewhere, sometime, it would start again. The attacks, the transformations, the impossible becoming horrifyingly real. And when it did, this time the city wouldn't be completely unprepared. This time there would be people who knew what they were facing, who had resources and knowledge and the will to act. It wouldn't be easy. It might not even be enough, but it was something. A defense against the darkness that official channels couldn't provide. A recognition that some threats existed outside the bounds of normal law and order. Wright never saw Whitmore again. Never learned if the man found peace in the wilderness, or if the curse continued to haunt him until his death. Never discovered what happened to the woman or the dock worker or the others who'd prowled New York streets that terrible autumn. Some questions remained unanswered. Some endings remained unresolved. Such was the nature of dealing with things that shouldn't exist but did. Years later, when Wright was an old man, retired from the force but still maintaining his private network, he received a package. No return address. Inside was Whitmore's journal, filled now with additional entries. Years of them. Whitmore had survived, had found a way to live with his curse. In the sparse, populated territories of the West, he'd helped others like himself, had created his own network of the cursed who wanted to maintain their humanity, had fought to manage something that couldn't be cured, but could, with effort and will and constant vigilance, be controlled. The final entry was dated just weeks before the package arrived. Whitmore wrote that he was dying, finally, of natural causes, that the curse would die with him, that he wanted Wright to know his intervention had mattered, that choosing not to pull the trigger that night in the cemetery had saved more lives than ending one. That mercy had proven stronger than justice, even when justice seemed like the only logical choice. Wright kept that journal with his other records, added his own final entry to the case file, marked it closed, not because it was solved, but because all the principals were dead or disappeared. The curse itself remained, would always remain, waiting in bloodlines and dark places for its next opportunity. But the specific incident of 1895, the werewolf attacks that had terrorized Lower Manhattan for 3 terrible months, was over. The city had survived, had forgotten, had moved forward the way cities always do, building new structures over old traumas, paving over the past with the promise of the future. But the truth remained in Wright's files, in the knowledge passed down through his network, in the preparations made against the next time, because there would be a next time. The pattern promised that, the history confirmed it, and somewhere in New York, even now, someone carries the curse in their blood. Someone who doesn't know yet what they are, what they'll become, what darkness waits inside them for the right trigger, the right moment, the right alignment of moon and stress and ancient hunger. The city doesn't know, doesn't want to know, would reject the knowledge if offered because accepting it would mean accepting that the world contains things that shouldn't be possible. That law and order and civilization are thinner protections than we'd like to believe. That sometimes the only thing standing between humanity and the darkness are people willing to operate outside the system, to make impossible choices, to fight threats no one else will acknowledge exist. Detective Samuel Wright understood that, lived it, built something from that understanding that continues to this day, informs most people will never see or recognize. A quiet vigilance, a preparation for nightmares, a willingness to believe the impossible and act accordingly. The gas lamps of 1895 have been replaced by electric lights, the horse-drawn carriages by automobiles, the narrow tenements by towering skyscrapers, but beneath all that progress in the spaces between the buildings, in the darkness that no amount of artificial light can completely eliminate, the same old threats persist, the same curses wait, the same monsters hunt, and the same choice faces every generation. Deny the darkness and hope it goes away, or acknowledge it, prepare for it, and fight it with everything available, even when the law provides no guidance, and morality becomes desperately unclear. Wright chose to fight. His network continues his work. The files remain. The knowledge persists. And when the curse returns, as it inevitably will, someone will be ready. Not because they want to be, not because it's easy or safe or even legal, but because someone has to stand between the innocent and the nightmare. Someone has to remember what others forget. Someone has to believe in monsters so the rest of the city doesn't have to. That's the real story of 1895. Not the attacks, not the creature, not even the investigation. The real story is about the choice to remember, to prepare, to acknowledge uncomfortable truths, and act on them despite every instinct toward denial. It's a story that continues in the shadows of New York, and probably always will, as long as the city stands and the curse persists, and people remain willing to fight the battles no one else will admit need fighting. The whispers echo through the forgotten corners of New York's history. Stories buried beneath decades of progress and noise, but some tales refuse to stay silent. Some nights refuse to be forgotten, and in 1895, the city learned a lesson it immediately chose to forget. That monsters are real, that curses exist, and that the only thing protecting us from the darkness is the vigilance of those willing to face it. The files remain locked in private archives. The network continues its quiet work, and somewhere in the city tonight, under the electric lights and the noise and the constant motion, something that shouldn't exist walks on two legs among the crowds, waiting, watching, counting the days until the moon goes dark and the curse takes hold once more. The cycle continues, the pattern repeats, and those who know, who remember, who prepare, continue their endless vigil against the night.